Lion is perhaps one of the most famous preserved steam locomotives in Britain. This is thanks to its appearance in the 1953 Ealing comedy, The Titfield Thunderbolt. But how did Lion appear when it was built back in 1838? One thing we can be sure of is that Lion, if indeed the locomotive now known as Lion is actually Lion, has only looked the way it does since 1930. Its present appearance is down to a committee of engineers and experts who, based on the examination of the surviving fabric of the locomotive, argued quite correctly that it had been built in the 1840s, but with a later boiler. The frames, wheels, cylinders, pistons, valves and valve gear are all of a type from the 1840s. In fact, the valve gear was invented in 1840 by William Barber Boudicom and was made pretty much obsolete in 1845-1846 with the invention of the Stephenson link valve gear, so it's pretty closely dated. The boiler is of course later, probably made in the 1860s, from the size of the plates used, and that some of the plates have been flanged by pressing rather than by hand indicates a mid to late 19th century date. The Reconstruction Committee was given pretty much carte blanche by the LMS to reconstruct the locomotive as they saw fit. And they did so not to a Liverpool and Manchester Railway appearance, but instead to a hypothetical goods engine running on the North Midland Railway sometime in the 1840s. Some parts of the locomotive had to be made from new because they were worn out, whilst many others were missing and had to be replaced. The Reconstruction Committee's meetings are fascinating because at one point they concluded that the locomotive had no springs, which it very clearly did. So of the locomotive first found in 1919 and restored at Crewe in 1930, the original riveted wrought iron chimney was lost in 1930 to be replaced by the present chimney with its rather ludicrous copper cap. The smoke box doors were also replaced because they were rotten, but they were replaced like for like. New springs, wheel splashers, buffers, outside fly cranks, coupling rods, footplate rails and a new tender were provided. So too was the enormous copper firebox casing, designed to make it look as if the restored locomotive carried an 1840s Arc de Quatre, alias Gothic firebox, or perhaps also known as a Haycock firebox, which it absolutely does not. Two myths have attached themselves to the 1930 tender. The first is that it was made from original Robert Stephenson and Company drawings, and the second is that it is an original Furness Railway tender which was adapted, quote-unquote. Both of these are incorrect. Tender drawings were indeed supplied by Robert Stephenson and Company, but they created a tender from whole cloth, from new. Secondly, going by the numbers stamped on the tender components, the tender is cobbled together from pieces of at least 3 Furness Railway tenders, and it's been very, very heavily modified with evidence of electric welding. So the line we see today is a product of the 1930s reconstruction, to a supposed appearance for an 1840s goods locomotive working on George Hudson's North Midland Railway. So if the reconstruction of Lion is entirely inaccurate, what did Lion look like during its working life? Sadly, there are no known general arrangement drawings for the locomotive, but we do have 2 key pieces of evidence. The first is a boiler specification for Lion and its sister engine Tiger, and the second is a general arrangement drawing for the Samson, a locomotive ordered as part of the same batch as Lion. The 1838 boiler barrel of Lion was specified to be 7 feet 6 inches in length and made from 4 longitudinal plates, a type of boiler known as a long plate boiler, and because of its construction was slightly oval in cross-section, being wider than it was tall. However, Edward Woods, the chief engineer of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, notes that the boilers of Lion and Tiger were in fact 7 feet 4 inches, but it's not clear where and how he was measuring them. It's also worth noting that this means the original boiler of Lion was either 12 or 16 inches shorter than that now carried on the locomotive. Furthermore, whilst the Lion we see today has 2 pairs of 5 feet diameter driving wheels, such large wheels won't physically fit under a boiler 7 feet 6 inches long, but 2 sets of wheels 4 feet 6 inches will, and this suggests that Lion as built had smaller wheels than the preserved locomotive, and it's further evidence that the preserved locomotive may not in fact be Lion. And having smaller wheels would in fact be beneficial for a goods locomotive, as it would increase the tractive effort. The boiler specification states that the firebox, unlike that on the preserved locomotive, was like that of Planet, to be only slightly raised above the boiler barrel. The firebox was to be surmounted by a steam dome with a brass casing and in which a safety valve was inserted. A second safety valve with ornamental brass casing was to be placed on the front of the boiler behind the chimney. Midway down the boiler barrel was a second steam dome, also with a brass cover. At the rear of the boiler barrel was a manhole cover, again with a brass cover. So Lion would have looked very different in terms of boiler length and boiler fittings. Lion was also built to 2 patents, that of Robert Stephenson and that of John Melling. So in the latter case, this means there would have been a water tank beneath the firebox ashpan, into which waste steam from one of the safety valves was directed to preheat the feed water before it was pumped into the boiler. It is also likely that Lion had a steam brake, as one is included in Robert Stephenson's patent for a 6-wheel locomotive. The tender carried by Lion would have been a standard Stephenson tender, so identical to that running behind the replica of Planet. In terms of livery, locomotives of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway were painted overall dark green, and this includes the boiler cladding. The frames and wheels were also green, but some contemporary sources also indicate black frames. The tender frames and body were also green, and the boiler bands were painted black, and much of the bright and fancy work would also have been painted with black varnish. Numbers were carried on the chimney in cut-out brass numerals and painted on the buffer beam in white. Again, very different from the preserved locomotive, which has lots of polished wood and brass, looking more like a toy than a working locomotive. All of this means that Lion, during its working life from 1838 to 1859, looked very, very different from the locomotive we see today in Liverpool Museum. And the locomotive we see today is entirely the product of a restoration at Crewe in 1930 to a supposed not 1830s but 1840s appearance. I hope you have enjoyed this video, and if you have, please leave a comment below, as well as like, share and subscribe, and click the notification bell. I'd like to thank all my supporters on Patreon and Ko-fi for making this video possible, and details to support Rail Story via Patreon or Ko-fi are in the video description below. And I look forward to seeing you all next time on Rail Story.